Hi guys, how are you all today morning? Good morning. Today is 17th September 2023. My name is T.S.V. Raghavan and I live in Chennai, Tamil Nadu, India. This is my spiritual vlog on YouTube. Hardan, 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 Haribol, TRSV, Nectar, NECTAR, Nectar. In this particular vlog, in all my previous videos, we have been discussing about the knowledge and information that we have gleaned through the study of spiritual books, scriptures, contemplation on the material universe, and meditation on the spiritual universe. This particular video in this vlog is no exception to that rule. In fact, it is a mere continuation of all that we have been doing in all my previous videos. Kindly subscribe to this vlog and press the bell icon so that I may keep reminding you of all my other past and future videos. So let us continue with the topic for discussion in this particular video. After meditating and contemplating for hours about this subject, I came to a conclusion that it would be far better for every viewer or devotee interested in self realization and liberation and final deliverance to the Supreme Personality of Godhead to go into the complete process step by step, because everything has happened in the life of every living entity only slowly, steadily, and step by step. How is it so? Let us analyze this. First, let us visualize a bonfire. A bonfire is a fireplace which has fire in mass crackling merrily inside it. This fire is attractive to all those who love heat for their bodies, to cook food, to do some merry, etc. In this bonfire, there are, of course, some fire sparks which keep coming out of that bonfire and entering the air outside in the atmosphere and space. These fire sparks are qualitatively similar to the fire in the bonfire. It means that every cell in every fire spark is as energetic as the energy of fire in that bonfire. In other words, both are similar. However, because these fire sparks are quite small, they are not equal in quantity to the actual bonfire. The bonfire in total is a mass of fire, whereas these fire sparks which got ejected out of that bonfire are individuals fighting with air in the space. Naturally, these fire sparks lose out in the battle knowingly or unknowingly in different moments. In other words, they get extinguished by the air floating or circulating in the space. The air, though material, is far superior to these qualitatively probably superior fire sparks. The energy of the air is far greater than these individual sparks. Now, let us compare the spirit whole to the bonfire. The spirit whole is a mass of spiritual energy which is existing as a collective object in this world. Out of these spirit whole, some spirit souls or spirit sparks eject out because of deliberation or otherwise, knowingly or unknowingly, with default or due to design, etc. It may be advertent or inadvertent, but the fact remains that spirit sparks eject out of this spiritual whole occasionally or regularly or perpetually. It has been happening so for times immemorial, and we do not know the actual reason for such occurrence. However, unlike the fire sparks which got ejected out of the fireplace or bonfire, these spirit sparks which got ejected out of the spiritual whole do not get extinguished. There are individual spirit sparks which exist even after such ejection. They do not get extinguished. Spirit is Lord's superior energy and material world is Lord's inferior energy. But before we can jump into any conclusion, we must remember that both material and spirit are the supreme personality of Godhead's personal own energy. Hence, the superior spirit spark need not or dare not grapple with the material energy because it is inferior to it. If it does, this spirit spark comes to grief and how. I will explain that in detail here. When the spirit spark, after floating or circulating endlessly in this space, finally one day comes across the material world and gets attracted to it, it tries to gravitate towards this. Till now, it is just a spirit spark, raw and totally unevolved. However, though it may take a long time, one day or the other, the individual spirit spark is quite likely to get in touch with this material world. The moment the spirit spark does that, it becomes a spirit soul. What this spirit soul or spirit spark thinks is not known, but the fact remains that the material world as such is very, very irritated by this unwelcome contact with the spirit soul. The spirit soul, like the spirit whole and the spirit spark, are God's superior energy, but the individual spirit soul is no match to the material world, which may be the inferior energy, but which is collectively huge and gigantic in mass. This is exactly like when a shellfish keeps its mouth open inside the ocean to attract food particles, suddenly comes across some unwelcome foreign object like a piece of sand, stone, etc., fall into that open mouth. This shellfish is not able to spit it out and at the same time gets very irritated and angry with that foreign object which has intruded into its privacy and physical structure. Just like that, the material world gets very, very irritated by the contact with the spirit soul. Both cannot spit these intruders out of their system. The shellfish instead wraps this foreign particle with layers of its own saliva and transforms this foreign particle into a priceless pearl. Similarly, this material world wraps this spirit soul with four layers of material body to make it from a raw, unevolved spirit soul into a living entity. The moment this happens, this individual spirit soul loses its individuality as a soul and starts living life like a living entity. This can happen in years, eons, or millenniums. It is not a fast process. Further, the gap between these layers of material body wrapped up or being wrapped up against this spirit soul may take eons, millenniums, or years. As for example, the first causal body of intelligence is the immediate one that may even take eons or years before wrapping this spirit soul. After that, there is a long gap before the astral body of mind, feelings, and emotions wraps up both the causal body of intelligence and the spirit soul. Similarly, there is a very long gap between when the third layer of etheric body of five senses, namely sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, wrapping up these astral bodies of mind, causal bodies of intelligence, and the spirit soul together takes ultimate result, or it takes a long time before this etheric body of such senses takes a long time between the wrapping up of the spirit soul with the causal body of intelligence and astral body of mind. There is a very long gap between such a wrapping up of the spirit soul. However, the moment it is wrapped up with the first layer, this spirit soul ceases to exist as an individual, raw, unevolved spirit soul and turns its identity into a living entity. Same happens when there is a very long gap between these three subtle bodies of causal intelligence, astral mind, and etheric senses are wrapping up this material body. The gross body, which makes the fourth layer, takes a long time before originating or being born and wrapping up all the subtle bodies and the spirit soul. In other words, there is a long gap not only between the spirit soul getting wrapped by the material bodies, but also between the same subtle bodies, the gross body, etc., which are material but they take their own sweet time to form and to wrap up the other parts or layers of that spirit, soul, and body. Once this is complete, the endless cycle of birth and death of that living entity begins at last. When all the four layers wrap up this spirit soul, this endless cycle of births and deaths begins. However, before proceeding, let me remind you that though all the four layers exist in every living entity, the possibility of all being not active is there in case of various species of living entities. The gross body of all the living entities becomes active first. In some cases, the etheric body of senses becomes active also sometime later, depending upon the evolvement of that living entity. However, before jumping into any conclusion, let me caution you that even the gap between both these bodies becoming active in the case of a living entity is very, very wide. So is the case when some living entities have partial or full action from the astral body of mind, feelings, and emotions. It does not happen immediately. 75 to 80% of the ordinary living entities, in fact more, have only the last two bodies that wrap the spirit soul active in their lifetime. Only very few have their astral body of mind getting active, and only a minuscule percent of the total living entities have their causal body of intelligence come into active form when the living entity tries to live through one of his or her birth. Usually, this happens only when that living entity is born as a human being, whether male or female. There are several species through which one living entity has to go through various births and deaths before reaching the level of a birth as a human being. This may take millenniums or trilliums. The first body or the first birth that spirit soul takes is that of a material cell. The second is algae, the third amoeba, the fourth grass, weed, creepers, plants, trees, insects, worms, ants, amphibians, reptiles, birds, bees, bees, and finally as human beings. This chain of repeated births and deaths is very long and it may take a very, very long time. Even when that living entity is born as a human being, there are at least 400 different types of 400 thousand different types of species of human beings. The average living entity may have to cover at least 50% of such species, and the activity or existence of karma and destiny happens only when that living entity is born as a human being. How many births as a different species of human beings that particular living entity takes depends on its individual destiny, karma, surrounding, atmosphere, intelligence, maturity, and experience. Some may take a very long time even in this particular form of birth, or some may take lesser number of births as a human being before getting evolved. This is a fact that we must keep in mind before proceeding further. It took, it took eons, trillions, and millenniums before this spirit soul turned living entity became fully evolved. Hence, the liberation from repeated births and deaths of that individual spirit soul is also gradual and step by step. In other words, one living entity, which is originally a spirit soul, does not get liberated immediately. The first process is for that particular living entity to get self realized through contemplation and meditation through different lives and births and deaths. This also takes a very long time. However, when such a person ultimately gets self realized, he or she finds that he or she is actually not this living entity but his or her original identity is that of a spirit soul. Though this person gets self realized in this process, the liberation from repeated births and deaths may take still a very, very long time. Liberation means shedding all these bodies, both gross and subtle, that have wrapped this particular spirit soul. The first body to shed by this particular living entity is that of the gross body alone. Through repeated births and deaths, that particular soul ultimately sheds or qualifies to shed that gross body. In other words, he or she, that spirit soul, need not take birth in a gross body into this material world. But this is only a step. The chain of births and deaths still exists. Yes, the process of being born in a gross body may stop for that particular living entity, but he or she will have to be born in one of the subtle bodies, namely that of astral mind of feelings and emotions for several births before getting qualified to shed even that subtle body and go to the causal body of intelligence. Usually, after a gap when the gross body is shed, the etheric body of senses also ceases to exist because the five senses of the etheric subtle body get an outlet through the five sense organs of that gross body, namely two eyes for sight, two ears for hearing, two nostrils for smell, one tongue for taste, and the skin and genitals for touch. When this gross body is shed, this etheric body of senses feels forlorn and helpless because it is not able to give an outlet into this material world of its own senses, which gets generated continuously. Hence, after a reasonable gap, when this etheric body of senses realizes that it cannot give an outlet into this material world of its own senses, it gets shed and drops out off. However, the other subtle body of astral mind of feelings and emotions remains there with that living entity for a very long time till all its vasanas, karmas, and destiny are totally worked out till that period, and this astral body of mind, of feelings, emotions, etc., is also dropped off. Now remains only one layer of the material body of causal intelligence and logic. There is only one gap between this material body and the spirit soul. Even that gap is very long. It takes a lot of time to shed even that causal body of intelligence by that spirit soul. So, step by step, slowly and steadily, all the layers of material body that began wrapping up this spiritual eons ago are ultimately shed. This I wanted to tell you to show you that nothing happens immediately or overnight. Even the wrapping of the spirit soul by the material body of several layers takes its own sweet time, and hence it also takes its own sweet time for each body to drop off this cocoon of material bodies that entrap the spirit soul. Only when the spirit soul comes to its own actual existence, and only when these material bodies and their layers are finally dropped off, can this spirit soul meditate to get liberated from repeated chain of births and deaths. Thus, at last, as a fully evolved spirit soul, it decides to shy away from this material world. After that, there is a very long gap between final liberation from repeated births and death and getting delivered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. I wanted to remind every viewer that this is an extremely slow and a long drawn process. Hence, please note that even when you know about the ultimate aim of getting delivered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it does not happen overnight. It happens only step by step. Hence, I request every living entity to start working on this process and to start walking on this long drawn and winding road towards the ultimate self realization, liberation, and deliverance to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It depends on individual spirit souls how long it takes for them to get liberated, self realized, delivered, etc. I wish every one of these viewers all the best for a quick wrap up of this whole process and finally reach the Supreme Personality of Godhead without wasting any time. This is all I wanted to tell in this particular video. Kindly let me know what you think of my talk on this particular matter. Please give me your expert opinions, thoughts, views, and ideas so that I may blend everything together for the sake of this society of ours. Before concluding, let me remind you that I am also a published author with Amazon Kindle and paperback. I write on spiritualism, fiction, and assorted subjects. Spiritualism happens to be my favorite subject. Till we meet in my next video, it is good morning from TSV Raghavan.